and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I'm taking your advice. I'm working on the marketing skills, so I'm going to ask you at the beginning of the video, please subscribe to the channel if you want to support me, and you can also join my Patreon. We have a really important end goal there that I'll talk about at the end of the video. Are any of you fans of the X-Files? I would venture to guess that you are. I'm a huge fan. I've seen each episode more times than I can count. But if you've seen the show, you'll remember those episodes where there's like some sort of beast loose in a town that's terrorizing the community. There's the Jersey Devil episode. There's the one in the forest with that monster that's killing people in the woods. And then, of course, one of the best episodes, in my opinion, is where Mulder and Scully are featured on an episode of Cops. And there's this unseen force terrorizing people in Los Angeles. Why am I talking about these episodes of the X-Files? Because when I started researching this case and watching interviews with the police officers who chased the man we are talking about today, those officers speak about this man the way people speak about the monsters in those episodes of the X-Files. This man was not a man. He was a monster. And not only did he do terrible things, he enjoyed doing those things perhaps as much, if not more, than any other killer I've come across. He liked to play games with people. He liked to stalk them, and he liked to let them know they were being stalked. He enjoyed terrorizing people and scaring people, and even some of the cops were scared of him. Some of the police officers' families actually went into hiding. There is an old African proverb that is one of my favorite sayings of all time, and it goes like this: "The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth." It gives me cold chills every time I hear it. And there is no better example of that proverb than the story of Allan Legere, the Monster of Miramichi. I'm Stacy Lee, your host. Let's get into it. February 13th, 1948. Allan Legere is born in Chatham Head, New Brunswick, which for us Yanks is in Canada. This was a rough area. Now, I know rough is a relative term. Rough in Canada versus rough in the United States. Those are two different things. But I did read that this area of Chatham Head along the river is not somewhere you'd want to go riding a bike or walking by yourself. People in that area often don't have enough to eat, and they never have enough money. Allan Legere's mother, Louise, would rent out rooms in the house to bring in enough money to keep the heat on during the long, cold winters. Louise would often have sexual relations with some of her lodgers, and one of those lodgers fathered her fourth child, Allan. This man then disappeared, and Allan never knew his father. Allan's mother was, I'll say it like the nice Canadian man did on the documentary I watched while researching this. She was not selective about her partners. That's the most pleasant way of saying it. So we're kind of in Gary Ridgway territory, the Green River Killer. Young boys and adolescent boys need to see their mothers as asexual. When a boy is raised by a mother who is bringing lots of different men home and she is not private about her sexual activities, we often see very, very violent men created from the young boys who are subjected, what's the better word, exposed to that at home. Now, no one is saying women can't have a sex life. No one is saying women can't have as many partners as they want. But what criminologists and psychologists and doctors are saying is that part of a woman's life should be kept separate from her children. And when it isn't, it creates very serious problems. It's just a common sense boundary, but we know how many people are lacking common sense. The walls of the house at the Legere home were thin, and Allan would lay in bed at night listening to his mother's activities, and it made him very embarrassed and very, very angry. I heard a doctor call this activity enormously destabilizing for a young boy. It is not a good thing. And I know there are people out there who want to be free and open with their kids when it comes to a lot of things, and I agree. talk to your kids. But there are certain elements of life that need to remain private when you have children. And if you don't agree with me, go fight with some of the greatest minds and experts in our country. Don't bother fighting with me because I'm just repeating what they say. As Allan grew, he started to get into trouble. He had to share a room with his sister, and his sister would dress and undress in front of Allan. This also is very destabilizing for a young adolescent boy. It's not something doctors feel is healthy for either child, for a female and a male child to share a room at that time in life. But this is how Allan grew up. At school, Allan caused controversy. Some of the teachers thought he was a very troubled, bright, artistic boy. Other teachers saw him as a dangerous thug who was always getting into fights. And if all of this information that I've given you to this point weren't enough for us to know that we're creating a real monster here, Allan's older brother was killed when he was in junior high. He was walking over a bridge and he was struck by a car. Louise, Allan's mother, went into a very serious depression, and she would openly tell Allan all the time that she wished it had been Allan and not his brother who died. That is, oh my goodness. Louise had always resented Allan because she saw him as a burden. Allan's behavior had always been bad, and Louise hated him for the stress that caused her. By the time Allan was a teenager, Louise was sick to death of his bad behavior, and she didn't like her son at all. So you can imagine how that made him feel. People in the small community didn't like Allan either. His siblings didn't like him. His own mother doesn't like him. So he was a very troubled young man. He was also short and he was skinny, and so he started lifting weights. He began spending every evening in the gym and began eating to bulk up. Soon he was much more muscular than he had been in the past, and he was much more confident. Allan started walking around with a tight t-shirt or tank top or no shirt at all to show people in the area how much more muscular he had become. As a young adult, Allan went to work as a car salesman, but he never did very well. He struggled with money, and even as an adult, he was violent and known to get into fights. He got married and he had some kids, but he never left his life of crime. And Allan also liked to toy with people. He prided himself on being a really good burglar. He would break into people's homes with the people being at home. He would steal what he wanted and then he would slip out. But after a while, that wasn't enough for him. He wanted the people to know he had been there. On more than one occasion, people in the area would wake up with Allan standing over their beds, just watching them sleep. He enjoyed this. He liked causing fear in people. If the people didn't wake up when Allan broke in, and they didn't wake up when he went in their rooms and stood over them, he would do something to make sure they knew he had been in their homes. He'd often pull an article of clothing out of the closet and lay it on top of them as they slept. He would take dishes out of the kitchen cabinets and just kind of set them around. Really psycho stuff. Once he broke into a female minister's house and cut her underwear off her as she slept, and she didn't wake up. Oh my goodness. This, yeah, creepy stuff here. Yeah. Allan was also known to hate the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was really big in this area, but he would go on and on about the wealth of the Catholic Church, which, let's be honest, is gross. A wealthy church shouldn't be a thing. Don't get me started on that. Wealthy churches shouldn't exist. But he liked talking about how much he hated the church and anything to do with the church. Then Allan started burning things down. He'd take a book, he'd light the pages on fire, and then he'd take a rug in the home and tent the rug up over the burning book to give it just enough oxygen to keep it going, keep the fire going, but also give him an hour or so to get away from the scene of the fire. So when the police or the fire department was called to the fire and Allan was suspected, everyone would say, well, he's an hour away. He wasn't there when the house burned down. I mean, this is not an unintelligent man, just a very, very sick and very dangerous man. But petty theft, breaking and entering, and bar fighting, even arson, those things were child's play. No one had any idea how truly savage and truly dangerous Allan Legere was, but he was about to show them. 1986. Allan and two accomplices, Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, break into a little shop owned by 66-year-old John Glendenning and his wife Marie. Todd and Scott cut the power to the store so the owners would be in total darkness. These three men, what they did to this couple, I've said this before, it's easier for me to wrap my head around one horrific monster than it is several. This reminds me of the hi-fi murders that we covered last year. These three men, three of them, beat this elderly couple so violently. I can't even go into detail about some of the things that they did to these poor people, but they were there to rob the store, and they just beat these people because they were there. They beat John so violently that he died. Then they assaulted Marie, this elderly woman, over and over, and they beat her savagely. But after the men were gone, Marie regained consciousness. She woke up with her face in the toilet and a scarf tied around her neck that had been used to strangle her. And she crawled up the stairs to the phone and called 911. The doctors said she was barely recognizable as human when they brought her in. They said they could not believe she survived. Her attack was so vicious and so brutal and committed by not one, but three men. Her living through it really is some kind of a miracle. People had seen Allan Legere in the area, and because of his violent reputation, that's the first place the police went. Allan's two accomplices, Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, were known as little troublemakers, but they were not known to be that violent. They were also significantly younger than the 38-year-old Allan Legere. So Allan was arrested, and he went on trial as the ringleader for this horrific murder. And he was convicted on June 21st of 1986 and sentenced to life in prison. Now, we all know that life in prison in Canada does not mean life in prison, but he got a long sentence. Once Allan Legere was in prison, he became a model prisoner. His violent tendencies seemed to disappear, and he was known as someone the guards trusted not to give them any trouble. But Allan Legere had not changed. He was only manipulating the guards and getting them to befriend him. Allan had decided he was not going to spend his life in prison. He was making the guards like him and trust him because he had a plan. And it's a disgusting one, literally. Allan would take his own urine and put droplets of it down inside his ear over and over. And of course, this led to a very bad ear infection. They would take him to the hospital doctor, it would clear up, and then it would come back. Obviously, because Allan was still putting his own urine in his ear. Oh my gosh. So on May 3rd, 1989, it was determined that Allan needed to go to a hospital for medical treatment. He needed to go see a specialist because prison doctors couldn't get the infection to go away. Now, of course, for that, he has to be transported. So the prison guards put Allan Legere in feet shackles and handcuffs and put him in the prison van to take him to the hospital. What they did not know is that Allan had snapped off the TV antenna from the rec room and hidden it where the sun don't shine. Allan had also spent months making a handcuff key that he's got in his mouth. As soon as Allan gets in the van, he uses that key to unlock his handcuffs, but he leaves the handcuffs on so it looks like he's still cuffed. The prison van gets to the hospital, and Allan tells the guards that he's got to go to the bathroom. So as soon as he's inside the bathroom stall, he removes the previously unlocked handcuffs and removes, unsheaths, extracts the TV antenna from its special hiding place, and he goes at the guards with it. This is Canada, so the guards don't have guns. They've got pepper spray, and that's about it. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I don't know if it was the actual metal bar the guards were afraid of or where it came from. But Allan somehow gets past them, and they're just left kind of pepper spraying the back of his head. So Allan gets to the hospital parking lot, and he accosts a woman in the parking lot, pushes her over, and gets in the car with her. This woman gives him her keys, and Allan takes her hostage. This woman later said Allan flipped from being very calm to very intense and angry. He finally did let the woman go and promised her he wouldn't hurt her car. Allan then drives to Monkston and dumps the vehicle. He walks away from the car and vanishes into thin air. A massive search begins, and the public is alerted that a very dangerous murderer has escaped from prison. The police and the public agreed. Everyone in the area knew Allan Legere. They knew what kind of man he was. The police went on the news and told the public they did not think there was any way Allan Legere was going to stay in the area. So after a few days, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, confident that this killer had moved on. They could not have been more wrong. May 29, 1989. Officers are called to a shop fire. The fire department is already there trying to put out the flames. This little shop was burning, and the woman who ran it lived on the second floor. Her name was Annie Flam, and she was 75 years old. This was the kind of little neighborhood shop that kids would go to buy candy, and people would stop to buy milk and eggs. Annie's sister-in-law, Nina, was her closest friend and lived in the house adjacent to the shop. Both women were well known and loved in the community. When the fire was out, Annie was dead, and Nina, who had been in the shop with Annie, was barely alive. Both women had been beaten severely. Nina was covered in second and third degree burns, but she wanted to speak with the police. She told them about the man who had come into the shop, assaulted the women, beaten them severely, and then set the shop on fire. Nina told police that the man had entered the store wearing a ski mask and demanding money, but then it escalated and he tied her to the bed upstairs. Nina played dead after she was beaten and assaulted, and the man left and went back downstairs. But Nina's bed in the fire had caught almost completely on fire. She was burned very badly. They found 75-year-old Annie tucked in her bed. This monster had beaten her horribly and then tucked her into bed. That's just, there's something so dark about that to me. I can't quite figure out why that bothers me so much. Annie had not survived her injuries. She had a broken jaw and she had been brutalized. Her cause of death was not fire or smoke inhalation. She had choked on her own vomit. Oh, her attack had been so bad that she had thrown up. I mean, oh my hell. Psychologists would later say that a killer like this targets elderly victims because they are weak, they are frail. The killer himself feels weak as a person, and only by attacking people who are frail and weak can he feel strong. It's sick. It's sickening. Now, remember, at this time, the police have assumed that Allan has left the area. They didn't think there was any way he would stay in the area where everybody knew him. So they didn't even consider him a suspect in this terrible crime. But then Nina remembered something, and she asked to speak with the police again. The man who attacked Annie and Nina wore a chain around his waist, a belly chain. Who wears a chain around their waist? Prisoners do. It seems a bit odd that Allan wouldn't have removed that chain after escaping, but for whatever reason, he didn't. After hearing this bit of information and knowing the kind of crime that was committed, police felt confident that Allan Legere had not, in fact, left the area like they assumed he would. And now he was once again their problem. As word got out that police believed Allan was still in the area, the town was thrown into an atmosphere of fear. Terror might be more accurate. People began to ask themselves, did I ever have a run-in with Allan? Did I ever make him angry? They began to speak about Allan as if he was the boogeyman. Gun sales in the area skyrocketed, and people were double and triple locking their doors. Officers told people to cut sticks to put in their windows so they couldn't be opened by sliding them, only by breaking the glass, which hopefully would alert people to an intruder. Parents stopped letting their children walk to and from school, and things got very tense. Then police began to get reports of a prowler. Night after night, people were calling the police station with reports of someone in their backyard looking in through their windows. They could never get a good look at this man, but they were insistent he was there. And then after a week or so of this, there was a break-in. A man came home from work to find a dark-haired man trying to break into his house. He ran towards the man, and the man took off running. He called the police, who came and did a search of the property. There in the grass were a pair of prescription eyeglasses. These glasses right here. As investigators looked over them, they realized they were prison-issued glasses, and the prescription matched that of Allan Legere. The Monster of Miramichi was back in his home territory, and he was stalking his prey. October 13th, 1989. A man is walking through the neighborhood in Newcastle and sees flames and smoke coming from the home of Linda and Donna Donnie. Linda was 41 and Donna was 45, and they were well known and loved in the community. They were a pair of unmarried sisters who had always lived together. The police and fire departments were called to the scene, and the fire was put out relatively quickly. Police entered to investigate, and there they found the bodies of the two sisters. Both had been beaten brutally. Both had been assaulted, and both of the sisters had suffered immensely. A journalist who saw the bodies said the images will never leave him, and that it is terrifying to him that a human being can do things like what he saw to another human being. Psychologists who have studied Allan Legere said it wasn't enough for him to kill. He wanted to destroy. He wanted to destroy the person, their face, their body, even their house and their possessions. It wasn't about just hurting the person or even killing them. It was about obliterating them. I couldn't find information to verify this, but I wondered as I was researching this if Allan was on steroids, because it sounds like he was such an angry person, and then you put steroids with that and get the roid rage or whatever. But I couldn't verify that. I just know he bulked up really quickly, and he could have been using steroids, maybe not. I don't think he needed the steroids to be any angrier than he already was. Now, this time, because the fire was put out so quickly, investigators were able to get DNA off of the sisters' bodies, and it matched the DNA of Allan Legere. So word spread like wildfire that this actual monster was in the area, escaped from prison, and was killing the area residents. Police held a press conference, and this officer told the public, "Allan Legere is the most dangerous and wanted man in Canada." The area descended into full-scale panic. People started sleeping with their lights on. They kept all their exterior lights on, and some residents even purchased and installed new street lights. To this day, those lights are called Legere lights, put up for the sole purpose of keeping this monster out of the dark. Police began patrolling the neighborhoods with dogs, and on more than one occasion, the dogs led their handlers to the backyards of the prosecutors and police officers who had been involved in Allan Legere's initial arrest. This guy had a vendetta, and he was watching and he was waiting for his time to strike. One night, officers were patrolling the woods near Allan's home, the woods that he was very familiar with and might be hiding in. And as they walked along this railroad track here, they heard a gunshot and saw a muzzle flash coming from the woods. They all dove to the ground and quickly called in backup. Allan Legere had taken a shot at the police. They laid there in the woods, too afraid to move, and then a second shot was fired. A couple of the officers I watched interviews said that they felt like they were chasing a ghost, someone who could see them, but they couldn't see him. Luckily, none of the officers were hurt that night, but as word of what happened spread, the panic level went up another notch. Now he's shooting at the police. The town was so terrified that it canceled Halloween. All of the children were allowed to wear their costumes and come to a party inside the school gymnasium, which you can see here, and that was their Halloween that year. They wouldn't even let their kids go trick-or-treating. People in the community were terrified, and they were convinced that Allan Legere was enjoying this. He had them right where he wanted them. November 1989. Remember earlier when I talked about how much Allan hated the Catholic Church? He decided it would be his next target. Father James Smith was a well-respected priest in the community. He lived in the rectory right next to the church. This was a Roman Catholic priest in a Roman Catholic town, and many people relied on Father Smith for counsel. One night he failed to turn up for prayer service, and that was just something that he did not do. So some parishioners went to his house next to the church and knocked, but there was no answer. They peeked inside, and there they saw the body of their priest lying on the floor of his home amid some chairs that had been overturned. There had definitely been a struggle. The police were called, and Officer Mason Johnson arrived on the scene. This is Officer Johnson then, and this is him now. He could not believe the level of violence that the town priest had endured. Father Smith's throat was cut, his chest was slashed, and he had been beaten, brutally beaten. Later at autopsy, even more brutality would be discovered. The killer had jumped on top of Father Smith's body with both feet, separating his ribs from his sternum. Police were confident the killer was Allan Legere, but he was still nowhere to be found. There had now been 4 brutal murders in the area, and it had been 6 months since Allan Legere escaped from prison. Police were alerted that some witnesses at the train station believed they saw Allan Legere boarding a train to Quebec. So that train was stopped and searched by the police. There they saw a man sitting in a seat on the train, and he looked like Allan Legere. Oh, sorry, you guys are not going to believe this. The officers had been told to ask anyone who looked like Allan to show them his arm, because Allan had a large eagle tattoo on one of his arms. The officers approached the man and asked him to roll up his sleeve. The man calmly did so. There was no eagle tattoo. You guys, it was Allan Legere. It was him. But the officers asked to see the wrong arm, and they didn't ask to see the other arm. No big whoop. We're just searching for an actual beast, an actual monster, but don't ask to see the other arm. Am I having a stroke? The officers walk away and leave Allan on the train. He makes it all the way to Montreal, and he believes he's free. He pawned some jewelry that he'd stolen from the Donny sisters, and now he had some money in his pocket. So you'd think that he would use that money to get out of the country, right? But for reasons known only to Allan, he makes a U-turn and goes back to the Miramichi. He hijacked a truck and headed home. Witnesses who saw the carjacking called the police and told them Allan Legere has just carjacked a man. And so the police began setting up roadblocks. It almost feels like he wanted to get caught, doesn't it? Or his drive for vengeance on the community that had rejected him was so strong that he couldn't leave. He hated that community and hated the people in it so badly for the way they had treated him that he couldn't get away from it. The child that is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Allan comes to one of the roadblocks set up by the RCMP, but there's a problem. He's holding the truck driver hostage. Some of the police said, he's going to fight to the death. But Officer Mason, who had been on this case from the beginning and knew Allan well, said, no, he's not. He's a coward. He's not going to fight. Officer Mason was correct. Allan stepped out of the truck, put his hands up and said, yeah, it's me. You got me. Allan was very violent with weak people like elderly women, but with armed police, he showed who he really is, a coward. As word spread of Allan's capture, the church bells rung in the town and people celebrated. The Monster of Miramichi had been caught. 2 years later, Allan went to trial and was found guilty of 4 counts of murder. Nina Flam's statement helped to convict him. Life went back to normal on the Miramichi, but the people there were left to wonder. How could their beautiful little town create such a beast? How was it possible for such a peaceful place to birth such a violent and dangerous monster? But we know this all too well. It doesn't matter where you live or at what time in history. We live among monsters all our lives. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you really want to support our community, join Patreon. The end goal there is to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money to test it. We want to help with that so we can close cold cases and get those perpetrators' DNA in the system. Those perpetrators might be linked to other cases, but because their DNA isn't in the system, we don't know that. We're going to be doing some fundraising on Patreon, but if you donate on Patreon and help support the channel, we can eventually get there. I'm so happy that you're here and part of our community, and thank you for spending part of your day with me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.